It began with a whisper about Princess Diana's first pearl necklace, an heirloom so emotionally charged that even seasoned palace aides reportedly froze when It began with a whisper about Princess Diana's first pearl necklace, an heirloom so emotionally charged that even seasoned palace aides reportedly froze when Charlotte's name appeared beside it. What should have been a tender inheritance moment became something far darker when whispers suggested Camilla wanted the gesture stopped before it reached the young princess. At first, it was treated as one of those quiet palace matters that never leaves the private files. A careful review of Diana's early jewelry collection, a discussion about what belonged to memory, what belonged to history, and what might one day pass into the hands of the next generation. But then Charlotte's name appeared and suddenly the tone inside the palace shifted. Reports suggest the necklace was not viewed as a simple piece of pearl jewelry. It was viewed as something far more dangerous, a living thread between Diana and the little princess who carries the future of the monarchy in her name, her bloodline, and her innocence. Catherine, according to palace whispers, understood the emotional weight immediately. For her, this was not about privilege. It was about a young girl being allowed to receive a part of her grandmother without politics poisoning the moment. Diana had never lived to guide Charlotte, never stood beside her at royal milestones, never whispered private encouragement into her ear. And yet, through that necklace, something of Diana's tenderness could still reach her. That is why Catherine was said to be deeply moved, because a mother knows when an inheritance is not made of jewels but of love, memory, and protection. William reportedly saw it the same way, though with a sharper edge. To him, the necklace was not palace decoration. It was a bridge between the mother he lost and the daughter he is raising. It carried grief, yes, but also survival. And for Charlotte to inherit, it would mean Diana's story had not been locked away, softened, or erased by time. It would mean that even after all the pain, the Princess of Wales still had a place inside the family she helped shape. But that was precisely what made the moment explosive. Insiders claim Camilla's circle grew uneasy at the thought of Diana's memory returning so powerfully through Charlotte. Because once the public connected those pearls to Diana and then Diana to Charlotte, the emotional force would be impossible to control. Rumors even suggest a refusal was demanded before the transfer became public, as if stopping the necklace could stop the shadow it carried. But what began as a delicate family matter quickly became a battle over memory, motherhood, and who truly owns Diana's legacy. Before crowns, titles, and palace protocols, there was Diana, a young woman whose pearls became more than jewels. They became symbols of innocence, rebellion, heartbreak, and survival. And now, decades later, one quiet necklace was said to carry the full force of her unfinished story straight into Charlotte's hands. For the royal family, jewels are rarely just jewels. They are messages. They are warnings. They are blessings passed quietly through generations, carrying the weight of those who wore them before. And Diana's pearls were different. They did not speak of conquest or cold power. They spoke of softness under pressure, of dignity in pain, of a young princess who learned to survive inside a system that often demanded silence when her heart was breaking. That is why this necklace, according to palace whispers, was not treated as an ornament but as a memory, one that still had the power to unsettle the very walls that once tried to contain her. Diana's image was always tied to a strange and powerful contradiction. She could appear graceful and fragile, yet still carry a quiet defiance that made the public believe she belonged to them as much as she belonged to the crown. Her pearls became part of that language. They framed her innocence in the early years, then her strength when the marriage began to fracture, and finally her independence when she stepped beyond the narrow role the palace had written for her. To inherit something from that chapter was not simply to receive a necklace. It was to inherit a story of pain endured, love withheld, and courage found in the very place where many expected surrender. That is why Charlotte's name changed everything. Many royal watchers have long seen echoes of discipline, grace, and quiet seriousness in the young princess, and those comparisons, however gentle, carry emotional force. Charlotte is not Diana, and no child should be forced to carry the burden of another woman's tragedy. But in royal symbolism, bloodlines matter, names matter, and gestures matter most of all. A necklace once connected to Diana reaching Charlotte would feel like a circle closing, not with triumph, but with something deeper, restoration. Catherine reportedly understood that better than anyone. As a mother, she knows the pressure of raising a daughter under royal scrutiny, where every expression, every appearance, every future choice may one day be weighed against tradition. For her, the necklace would not be a display of wealth. It would be a shield of memory, a quiet reminder that Charlotte comes from women who endured judgment and still stood firm. And in a family where legacy is often guarded by documents, titles, and rules, this inheritance carried a different kind of power, the power of love that refuses to disappear. And that symbolism, according to Palace Whispers, was exactly what made certain figures inside the royal household deeply uncomfortable. The alleged objection did not come as a public statement. It came, insiders suggest, through the cold machinery of palace discretion, questions raised, approvals delayed, language softened, and one chilling suggestion whispered behind closed doors. Perhaps Charlotte should refuse the necklace before Diana's name once again dominated the royal narrative. At first, those close to the matter reportedly framed it as protocol. Nothing emotional, nothing personal, nothing that could be called hostile. Just caution, just timing, just the old palace habit of wrapping uncomfortable decisions in polished language until the cruelty underneath became harder to name. But behind that careful wording, whispers suggested something far more sensitive was unfolding. Camilla's alleged discomfort was not simply about a necklace passing from one generation to another. It was about what that necklace would awaken the moment the public understood whose hands it had come from, whose memory it carried, and whose granddaughter was being asked to receive it. For years, Camilla's position had been protected through patience, ceremony, and the slow rewriting of public perception. The palace had worked carefully to soften the old wounds, to present continuity instead of conflict, and to place the present queen beside the king without allowing Diana's shadow to dominate every royal moment. But Diana's name has never behaved like an ordinary memory. It rises whenever the monarchy least expects it. It returns through her sons, through her causes, through the public's grief. And now, according to insiders, through Charlotte. That was the danger. Not the pearls themselves, but the emotion they would release. Camilla's circle reportedly feared that the inheritance would invite comparisons no one inside the palace could control. Diana, the beloved grandmother Charlotte never knew. Catherine, the composed mother guiding her daughter through the weight of royal life. Camilla standing in a position history still judges through complicated eyes. In that triangle of memory, the necklace became more than jewelry. It became a silent verdict. And if Charlotte accepted it, the public might not see a royal child receiving a family heirloom. They might see Diana returning to the center of the monarchy through innocence, grace, and blood. That is why the alleged demand for refusal felt so explosive. It was not presented as open hostility, but as management, a behind-the-scenes attempt, some whispers claim, to prevent a sentimental gesture from becoming a national story. Aides allegedly advised caution, warning that any move against Charlotte could look cold, even vindictive, especially when Diana's legacy remained so deeply protected by public emotion. Yet Catherine reportedly saw through the language immediately. To her, asking Charlotte to step back from that inheritance was not wise. It was emotionally cruel, historically blind, and painfully unfair to a child who had done nothing except stand at the edge of a legacy others were still fighting over. But the more the palace tried to contain the story, the more powerful the meaning of the necklace became. Catherine did not need to raise her voice to make her position clear. Reports suggest her silence inside that private exchange carried more force than any palace statement. For her, this was not about jewels, not about rivalry, and not about public image. It was about protecting Charlotte's right to inherit love without apology. Those who understand Catherine's place inside the modern monarchy know that her power has never come from spectacle. It comes from restraint, from timing, from knowing when silence can become sharper than protest. And in this alleged dispute over Diana's first pearl necklace, that restraint reportedly became her strongest weapon. Catherine was not defending a piece of jewelry. She was defending the emotional dignity of a child, the memory of a woman who still lives in the public heart, and the right of one generation of royal women to pass strength to the next without being treated as a threat. To Catherine, Diana's legacy could not be reduced to a palace inconvenience. It could not be managed away with cautious language, delayed approvals, or whispered objections. Diana was Charlotte's grandmother. That bond did not need permission from courtiers, and it did not need to be softened for anyone's comfort. The necklace, in Catherine's eyes, reportedly became a symbol of something deeply personal, a mother protecting her daughter from the cold politics that have so often surrounded royal women. If Charlotte was meant to inherit that memory, then no one had the right to make her feel guilty for accepting it. William, according to insiders, understood Catherine's emotional stance immediately. He knew the pain beneath it because Diana's absence was not history to him. It was childhood. It was grief. It was the empty space that no crown, no title, and no royal ceremony could ever fill. Catherine's quiet refusal to let Diana be treated like a problem reportedly gave William the strength to see the matter not as a family disagreement but as a line that could not be crossed. If Charlotte was asked to refuse the necklace, then Diana was being refused all over again. And that is what made Catherine's position so powerful. She understood how female legacy inside the monarchy can be controlled, softened, delayed, or redirected until its original meaning disappears. Queens, princesses, mothers, daughters, so often their stories are handled by others. But here, Catherine reportedly would not allow Diana's memory to be edited through Charlotte. The necklace became more than inheritance. It became a quiet act of royal resistance, a mother-to-daughter moment stretching across time from Diana's pain to Catherine's protection to Charlotte's future. For William, the necklace was never merely a family possession. It was a fragment of childhood loss and loyalty. Insiders claimed that when he learned of the alleged refusal demand, the heir's patience hardened into something colder. This was no longer about court etiquette. It was about whether Diana could still be honored inside the House of Windsor. For years, William had carried his mother's memory not as a public slogan, but as a private wound. Diana was not an abstract symbol to him. She was the voice missing from every milestone, the hand absent from every moment of triumph, the warmth that history could celebrate but never return. So when whispers suggested that Charlotte might be encouraged, pressured, or quietly guided to decline Diana's first pearl necklace, something inside the future king reportedly shifted. This was no longer a delicate palace matter. It became a question of loyalty. The necklace represented more than Diana's elegance. It represented her emotional survival. It carried the story of a woman who entered the royal world young, hopeful, and watched, then endured storms that would have broken many others. To William, that made the pearls sacred in a deeply personal way. They were not valuable because of their price. They were valuable because they had been close to Diana before the world fully understood her pain. And now for Charlotte to receive them would mean that Diana's presence had not been erased by time, remarriage, protocol, or carefully managed silence. William reportedly saw Charlotte as part of that continuing legacy. Not a replacement for Diana, not a public symbol to be used, but a granddaughter who deserved a link to the woman whose blood and spirit still shaped the future of the crown. In that sense, any attempt to make Charlotte decline the inheritance may have felt to him like a second rejection of Diana herself. According to insiders, William allegedly rejected the idea firmly. He understood the danger of open conflict, especially with Charles already carrying the burdens of kingship, health concerns, and a divided family atmosphere. But there are moments when peace becomes too expensive. If keeping the palace calm meant allowing Diana's memory to be treated as inconvenient, then William could not remain silent. His restraint, so often mistaken for distance, reportedly hardened into resolve, and that resolve placed Charles in an impossible position. On one side stood Camilla's alleged discomfort, wrapped in the language of discretion. On the other stood William, not only as a son defending his mother, but as the heir protecting what his daughter had every right to inherit. Beneath the royal surface, a quiet father-son tension began to form, heavy with old grief, old guilt, and unfinished history. And when Charles was pulled into the dispute, the private inheritance question became a full Windsor power test. King Charles reportedly found himself standing in the most painful corridor of his reign, between the wife he had crowned, the son who would inherit everything, and the memory of the woman the public never stopped mourning. One necklace had reopened a wound the palace thought time had sealed forever. For Charles, the alleged dispute could not have arrived at a more fragile moment. His reign had already been marked by pressure, illness, family distance, and the constant demand to appear steady even when the institution around him felt strained. Yet this was different. This was not a political crisis, not a constitutional question, not a matter that could be buried beneath formal language and official routine. This was Diana. And whenever Diana's name entered the room, the palace lost its usual control over the story. Camilla's alleged refusal demand placed Charles in a dangerous emotional and public position. If he sided too clearly with her concerns, he risked appearing to block his granddaughter from receiving a piece of her grandmother's memory. If he sided openly with William and Catherine, he risked exposing the very tension the palace had spent years trying to soften. Every path carried consequence. Every silence sounded like judgment. Every delay made the whispers louder. And in that silence, the old history returned with brutal force. William's firmness reportedly forced Charles to confront a truth he could never fully escape. Diana's influence did not end with her death. It survived in public loyalty, in William's grief, in Harry's wounds, and now most quietly and powerfully in Charlotte's inheritance. The necklace was small enough to be held in one hand, yet heavy enough to pull decades of unresolved pain back into the center of the monarchy. It reminded Charles that some legacies cannot be managed by protocol because they belong to the people's hearts as much as they belong to palace archives. Palace advisors, according to whispers, understood the danger immediately. Blocking the inheritance could look cold. It could look vindictive. It could look like the crown was still fighting a woman the public had already turned into legend. Diana's memory remained publicly powerful and emotionally untouchable, and any move against Charlotte would not be judged as a quiet administrative choice. It would be seen as a moral failure, a refusal to let a child receive love from a grandmother she never had the chance to know. So Charles reportedly began to understand that interference might cost more than silence. The safest move was not to command, not to defend, not to explain, but to step back and let the inheritance carry its own meaning. Yet stepping back did not mean the storm was over. It only meant that others, stronger in tradition and colder in execution, could now move around him. Behind the polished doors of the firm, tradition has its own defenders. And according to whispers, those defenders saw the alleged refusal demand for what it could become, a dangerous attempt to edit Diana out of Charlotte's inheritance. Once that fear spread, the palace machine began moving with icy precision. What had begun as a tender question about a necklace was now being treated, insiders suggest, as a matter of royal preservation. Senior aides reportedly understood that Diana's jewelry legacy was not politically optional. It was historically sensitive, emotionally guarded, and bound to the public's deepest feelings about the monarchy. To block Charlotte from receiving such a piece would not look like careful protocol. It would look like fear. Worse, it would look like the palace was still trying to control a woman whose memory had already escaped its grip. That is when the old guard allegedly began to stir. These were not figures moved by headlines or sentiment alone. They were people trained to think in decades, in bloodlines, in inheritance, in the silent language of royal continuity. To them, the necklace did not belong to a passing dispute. It belonged to the sacred chain between grandmother and granddaughter. Diana had been part of the monarchy's pain. But she was also part of its future because her blood ran through William, and through William it ran through Charlotte. No whispered objection could undo that. Princess Anne's name, according to some palace whispers, began circling quietly around the matter, not as a public combatant, but as the kind of old guard presence whose approval or disapproval can change the temperature of a room, and has always been seen as a guardian of discipline, duty, and family order. And if trusted traditionalists believed the necklace should pass properly, then Camilla's alleged influence began to meet something colder than resistance. It met institution. From that point, the story reportedly shifted. The necklace was no longer framed as a controversial gift. It became Charlotte's rightful emotional inheritance. Not wealth, not display, not a weapon against anyone, but a piece of Diana's story preserved for the granddaughter who never knew her. And once that framing took hold inside the palace, the alleged demand for refusal began to look smaller, sharper, and more dangerous to defend. Whispers even gave the moment a name, the Pearl Legacy Protocol. It was not an official decree in the public sense, but a symbolic line drawn around Diana's memory, a quiet doctrine that said some inheritances cannot be delayed for comfort, softened for optics, or denied because they awaken old ghosts. Camilla's alleged position, once protected by discretion, appeared weakened by the very backlash it had tried to avoid. And once the Pearl Legacy Protocol was whispered into motion, Camilla's alleged demand began collapsing under the weight of Diana's name. In the end, the necklace was not powerful because it glittered. It was powerful because it survived. It survived Diana's heartbreak, palace coldness, public grief, and decades of silence. And now, if the whispers are true, it has found its way to Charlotte, not as a jewel of privilege, but as a symbol of legacy reclaimed. By the time the alleged struggle reached its final turn, the necklace had become something no courtier could reduce to a private ornament. It had gathered too much meaning. It carried Diana's youth, her pain, her quiet defiance, and the strange tenderness of a grandmother reaching across time to a child she never got to hold. And for Charlotte, That inheritance was not about luxury. It was not about rank. It was an emotional victory, a sign that even inside a family built on rules, bloodline, and protocol, love could still slip through the cracks and arrive where it was always meant to arrive. Catherine and William reportedly understood that better than anyone. Their protection of the necklace was, in truth, a protection of Diana herself. Through Charlotte, they were not trying to reopen old wounds or create a public spectacle. They were refusing to let Diana's memory be treated as something dangerous, inconvenient, or better left untouched. Catherine stood as the mother guarding her daughter's emotional inheritance, while William stood as the son who knew that grief does not vanish simply because the palace prefers silence. Together, they turned a quiet transfer into a deeper statement. Diana still belongs inside the future of the crown. And that is why Camilla's alleged refusal demand, if true, became so damaging. It no longer looked like caution. It looked like control that had failed. The more the story was said to be contained, the more impossible it became to contain. The more Diana's name was treated as a threat, the more powerful it appeared. In the end, the palace seemed to understand what the public has always known. Diana's legacy cannot be managed like a schedule, locked away like a file, or softened to protect anyone else's comfort. So the monarchy, whether by choice or necessity, moved toward continuity over erasure. Diana's legacy did not return through scandal. It returned through innocence, through Charlotte, through a necklace that spoke without needing a single official word. And in that silence, the message became devastatingly clear. Some legacies cannot be refused, buried, or overwritten, no matter how carefully the palace tries. Because in the House of Windsor, jewels may pass through hands, but true legacy always finds the bloodline it was meant to protect. Claude is AI and can make M.